Hey everybody, in this video we're going to do something a little different. We're just going to talk about what it's like to actually own one of these long term and actually use it as a daily driver. This car behind me is my 1993 pearl on black car. It was, let's see, we've owned this car since 2003 at this point. My father originally purchased it from, I think, the second owner in California, and had this car in Iowa, and then I was driving an S6 Avant at the time. He bought an S6, C7 S6, decided to sell this one, and I decided I would rather have this sedan than my Avant, which sounds crazy, but the Avant was kind of new to me, so I hadn't totally bonded with it, and is actually currently for sale again. So if I can find the link, I'll put it in this video. And I said currently as of October 11th, 2022. So anyhow, we're going to talk about what it's like to own this thing long term. And actually, this thing, I've had this for 22 or 23 years. So I can tell you the ins and outs, and this is not really the buyer's guide, but more of a what is life like with an S4. So here we go. So one of the main things to remember, and I'm sure this is obvious, but these are not new cars. And as a result, there's a huge variety of, I guess, quality level of these cars on the roads are still alive. Many of them have been crashed and parted. And so finding a truly nice survivor at this point that's been, really well maintained is getting to be quite a challenge. And I will say that I think these cars are an absolute bargain right now. They are severely undervalued compared to, if you look at what's been going on with the rest of the classic European market, the other contemporaries of this car, even in the Audi lines, you see the 20 valve coupe quattros, and sedans are actually demanding as much or more than these, which I have a love for those, but they're not anywhere near this, the same caliber of car that this is. With that said, this has been my daily driver. This is my current daily driver. So 93 S4 here in Minneapolis. So I'm in Salt, which I know a lot of you cringe and think, oh, they're going to rust out. Well, they really don't. They're not that bad. If you take care of them, and yes, that means you have to be very fastidious about washing your car, taking care of your car. I take care of the leather frequently. I'm always conditioning this. Actually, at the moment, it has, what is it called here? CarPro Pearl. I've been experimenting with that, which is sort of like ceramic coating for leather. So I've been using that, and let me flip the camera here and show you the interior. So here's, inside the car, you can see it's actually in pretty nice shape. And I actually have not done any restoration type work in here on the leather or anything. It's just a matter of keeping the door panels. I've used a product called Vinylex, which they have unfortunately discontinued. So that's where I've switched to this CarPro Pearl. But basically this car is driven frequently, washed very frequently. It probably gets a wash every week when the weather is good, or at the very least every 2 weeks. Interior leather, this gets conditioned ever since I've owned these cars. I do this almost monthly, and it's just an old sock and Lexol. Come in with the Lexol conditioner, or like I said on this one, I've been experimenting with the CarPro Pearl. But other than that, let's see what has gone wrong in this car. Things that I've had a lower ball joint brake on the driver's front corner, and that actually was at low speed turning into a parking space. That video is actually on YouTube. You'll see that if you look back. That required a tow. The red car over here, that once lost a fuel pump while sitting at a red light. So that it got towed. It also suffered the same ball joint break, also in a parking lot turning into a space. I'm trying to think of, oh, I had replaced the fuel lines on this. So the red car actually has like modern, kind of like Volkswagen spec plastic fuel lines that they've switched over to. And I had an issue where the rear line basically disconnected. I didn't get the clamp on properly, and so it got a brief tow home for that, which took all of 30 seconds to fix, but because it was on a highway, that required a tow. Other than that, I've never had anything, let's see. Okay, always fun when you're filming and the phone interrupts you. But the only other thing that has occurred on both cars, I had the clutch pedal, basically the clutch slave fail, the pedal stuck to the floor. Years ago, I mean, that happened in 2003 or so on the red car. And I actually drove that car all the way across the Minneapolis Metro with no clutch. I push started it in first and managed to drive from Woodbury over to Chanhassen to have that replaced. And, you know, did it outside of prime traffic time, but it was still an adventure that I would not do again. This one I just had hauled all the way and dealt with. So the only thing I've had to do on this car, honestly, these are, I kind of jokingly say, these are the Toyota Camrys of the Audi model line. And they are incredibly reliable if you get a car that's not been abused. And the trouble is, a lot of owners buy these and they think that they are sports cars or drag race cars or something, and just simply because of the engine. I mean, obviously the engine is, you know, the prime interest in this car. But, you know, these are luxury sports sedans, and they're, if you treat it as such and don't completely beat the snot out of them, they will go and go and go. I mean, this one has about 190 on it. That one has 210. I've done compression and leak down on both, and they're both really solid. I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but I did write them down, and everything's good. So I guess it depends on, you know, do you need all the latest gizmos and things? I don't. I hate lane departure. I can use my own. I mean, I have cruise control, I have air condition, I have heat. I have actually a really nice stereo because I actually have removed the Audi Bose, and it's all MB Quart with amps and things. Other than that, I mean, it's got the nice, I've done the clutch. So all that is, you know, like relatively light clutch pedal. I mean, these still have a decent amount of effort even when they're brand new. They're not as light as like a new, you know, the new Audis. Like those things are lifeless switches basically. But this does have good pedal feel for brakes. We've got the big red brakes on this car. Trying to think of what else. Other than that, it's been timing belts. I've had to do a radiator. And this is all, I just did the heater core on this car for the first time since 1993. And I will say it lasted that long, I think partially in part because I do change the coolant. So every 3 years tops, drain it, refill it with the proper coolant with distilled water only. Yeah, same, do your brake fluid flushes. I mean, that's the thing. You keep your fluids fresh, let the car warm up before you really give it the beans. Let it cool down properly when you're coming home. I mean, don't come flying in and just shut it off and walk away. I mean, granted, it does have a coolant pump that circulates things, but it's just good to kind of bring them up to temp and bring them down to temp. And if you treat the car well, there's no reason you can't daily one of these. Now, if you buy a project car that has a whole bunch of things going on with it, yeah, you're probably going to think that they're terrible and unreliable, and you need to go through and do a lot of things. And I will show you under the hood, there's a few things that I've done on these cars that if you, I would say at this point, if anyone buys one of these and these aren't done, you should do them, because it's kind of some of the weak spots, especially as these cars age. Especially if you want to use one as a daily. I'm going to go under the hood here now, and I'm going to show you, if you want to daily this, do this, you know, and that will help you immensely. So Obviously, keep an eye on your under the car, like your fuel lines. They run down the passenger side underneath. They go through these rubber and stainless brackets. They tend to hold moisture there and will often rust out at that spot. Same with the fuel tanks. Watch the seam on the fuel tank. I use a product called Salt's Gone in the winter, and I spray everything really good. I also use fluid film, and will coat things prior to winter. But generally, rust isn't too bad of a problem if you really look after the car, if you keep it clean. And a lot of the times they rust when they've been in an accident and not really repaired to the level they should be. So that's most of the ones I've seen that are rusty are either neglected cars that sat outside or have had prior paint or accident damage. So anyway, we're gonna go under the hood. We're gonna look at a few things there. Okay, so under the hood, if you're gonna daily drive these, you'll basically find at this point the two things that make these not fun, obviously, leaks, and a lot of that is a boost leak or a coolant leak. And in terms of boost, the stock intake hoses on these they basically get, they're quite old at this point. Let's face it, 1993 was a long time ago. So they'll actually deteriorate down here, and it may look okay, but you'll find that if you remove the clamp, you'll see that it's actually split down here. So there's a little bit of oil will be down there. So this has the 034 set up on it. Now this used to be on my red car, which is RS2 spec and runs about 28.5 pounds of boost. I was actually having issues with, this is kind of a soft hose, and it would actually implode on itself a little bit. And so I've actually switched the one on the red car over to the 2 Bennett hose, which is, I could park a Buick on that thing and it doesn't it doesn't collapse. This car being just a stage 1 car, it works fine on here, so I moved it over here. Also, you'll notice the red hoses down here and here. There's also one on the lower intercooler, which is down in that corner. These are essential. This hose not so much, but certainly the ones that go to the crossover pipe coming out of the turbo here, and the lower intercooler hose, or the Michelin Man hose as some people call it, those blow up and you have boost leaks. That's very common. You'll notice that this also has an aftermarket coolant hose. These are like G+, I don't know if they're off eBay or what, but I actually have a full set of these. At this point, the coolant hoses on these cars are really pretty old, and you'll find that on my cars I would tend to condition them. I know it sounds crazy, but when I would clean the engine on these cars twice a year basically, I would then go through with a sock and Vinyl-X, and I would wipe down all these hoses with Vinyl-X so they'd actually get some sort of protectant on them. And it actually it's helped keep them nice and supple, and the plastics, etc., have all gotten that treatment over the years. And so obviously if you're dealing with a car that hasn't had that, then chances are they're going to be a little crusty, and you're going to have your work cut out for you. You're going to change some things. Like here, I've even got the heater core hoses down in here that have been replaced as they go into the firewall. You're going to spend some time doing all these hoses. There's also a critical hose that runs underneath this intake manifold. It's a coolant line, and it's really hard to see. Let me try to get a light here. Can't even get my camera in that position at all, but it's literally right under that manifold. If you put your hand under there, you can feel it. But I actually have a silicone replacement for that as well. And it's only maybe a foot long section, but I've seen those split and fail, and you end up spraying coolant everywhere, and it makes a big mess. Never fun. Also, the back of the engine, you're going to see the little coolant temp sensor down there, and that T valve. Mine is now aluminum. The factory is plastic right there, and those are prone to fail. In fact, you'll break one side of it off and you'll just rapidly dump all your coolant, which is a good time. So definitely replace that. Replace your throttle body cam here. This is not the stock plastic. This is actually aluminum now. And I think EFI sells these, and I believe 034 also still has these. And then one more coolant thing on the back of the engine here. You can see that hose right there. There's the outlet on the back of that. That is plastic from the factory, and you should definitely upgrade to the aluminum version, also from EFI. So do that. Those are kind of your primary must-haves, especially if you want to daily these things. Also, keep track of the condition of this tank. They tend to get old and crack, and you'll get leaks. Like I said, I did all the hoses on that as well. And then finally, talking about boost and just proper running, ignition system. So this is actually running the EFI Express LS coil conversion, which uses coils, and then basically it's like a wire set from a 91-200, I believe, that you then plug in to here. And it, normally the factory coils sit in here, and the factory ones actually work remarkably well for a long time if you're able to maintain all the stock wiring and everything. But they're getting harder to find, and they're really expensive. Whereas this conversion kit, you can do this in a half hour or less, and those are just simple LS coils. So I mean, you can go into any Napa store, any parts store, anywhere, and find them. So if you're on a road trip or daily driving this, to me, that is the kind of the no-brainer for that, and they tend to be pretty reliable. I've got these on both of my cars, and no issues yet. So got that. Boost related, you have wastegate frequency valve right down there. You can see my finger pointing at it. I'll zoom in. That's the top of it there. Let me see if I can get a little better view anywhere. But yeah, it's right down here, the lines. So that needs to be functional. Obviously, this is your bypass valve. Make sure that's installed the right way. A lot of these I've seen installed backwards. So, got the little nipple coming out the front here. Let me see the orientation. Yeah, so it should be oriented like that. And then what's really helpful is if you get a boost leak tester. So I have this, and this is a very handy tool. Actually, I unbolt the MAF right here from the airbox. Just pull the box out and stick this on the end and put some air. I actually run about 28 pounds of air through this, and then listen for leaks and track down your leaks, whether it be a bad hose or a clamp somewhere. But once you get that squared away, make sure you have no boost leaks. That's step one to winning the war, basically. So aside from that, it's just a matter of keeping your coolant clean, your Pentosan CHFS11 fluid. That's for power steering, etc. I actually change that out once in a while. Yeah, pretty straightforward. Don't have too many issues. Same with the brake fluid. Keep that clean. But if we move on to the suspension and brakes, this car is lowered. It's on H&R and Coney. Stock cars obviously ride really nice if you want a daily driver, but they do have a fair amount of nosedive when you hit the brakes hard. So you'll find a lot of these are on lowering springs and sport suspensions, and it works, but it really transforms the car. I will say, having driven a stock 94 for a while recently, it's amazing how refined they feel and what a nice kind of cruiser they are when they're stock. And it's crazy to say that, but I will say that the H&R and Coney, these are H&R greens, they tend to ride pretty hard. So this is one of the more aggressive ride quality. So it's not what I'd call super comfortable. The red car here has Eibach and Bilstein. Definitely prefer this setup. This is definitely more in suiting with the car's character, I would say. This has sharper turn in, though. I will say it's this one's a little bit more more engaging. It's kind of more fun to drive. Some of that also comes down to tires and everything else, but with that said, I still prefer the Eibach setup. It's kind of fun having both, and you can compare and contrast. But anyway, with the brakes, this has the 993 turbos, which was a pretty common and popular upgrade on these. Currently with the A8 Euro rotor. You'll see these with Boxsters, you'll see them with the 17Z Brembos, even stock G60s can work just fine for a daily car. You got to make sure they're working properly though, because if they are not, then they really suck. But the rear brakes are the problem child on these, especially if you live in the salty areas. And you'll find that caliper carrier here, the pins will seize in these, and sometimes they'll break off in there. And these are kind of hard to come by sometimes, especially the rear calipers. They, in many cases, don't exist. So what you do is you can actually convert and run the D2 S8 rear calipers on your car, and that's one potential option there. But e-brake cables, rear caliper, e-brake seizing, especially on the salty cars or on the older cars, that's an issue. If you get a car and it's kind of creaky in the rear, a lot of times that is the upper link arm. So there's just at the top of the rotor in the rear, they attach right behind the top section here, and there's a little arm. And if you use the cheap Chinese ones, they will last a year to a year and a half at best, and then they'll just creak like an old box cart. So avoid that if you can. I think finding these stock original ones are almost impossible anymore, but buy the best brand you can. Try to find a German OEM if you can. Other than that, suspension wise, the front upper strut mounts can be troublesome on these, especially once they're on the hard suspension, they just take a beating. So the strut bearings and mounts, and the same thing is the mounts that are available for the front. It's hard to get quality mounts anymore for these, and so that's going to be something that you might find yourself changing more often than you would have had to in the past. I'm actually going to, once I get this S8 out of the garage, this car is going in for an extended suspension rebuild. So it's going to end up on jack or lift in here and go after all the bushings and things. And that kind of brings me to the next point, which is parts availability. Now, I will say most of the parts I don't have much of a problem finding. I mean, I can get things under the hood, timing belt stuff, that's fine. We do have some really good parts suppliers that are still supporting these cars. EFI Express primarily, so big shout out to Mark at EFI for the billet stuff, and just some other, the ignition, timing belt stuff. You can get the hardened, timing belt gear, all that kind of stuff from EFI. And I believe Issam Abed in Canada makes a lot of that for them. Really good stuff. He's another asset to the community, I would say. Also, 034 Motorsport had supported these, but I've had very mixed results with some of their things. Yeah, it is what it is. I've had a few things work okay, but a lot of it has not worked out very well for me. So I would say brakes, everything else, especially if you're using Porsche brakes, those Brembos, you can find rebuild kits for them. You can find, this uses a A8 rotor, so that's actually still available and easy. The red car uses a genuine Porsche 993 turbo rotor, which is obviously still around, albeit very expensive. But yeah, everything else on these cars, this one is all RS2 specs. So as you can imagine, finding injectors and things, that's not super easy anymore, but you can get replica injectors if you need to. But fuel filters, oil filters, standard injectors, I mean, there's a lot of the stuff is easy. Even suspension, you'll find there's still lowering springs, there's still multiple shock strut options for these. Bilstein, Coney, Bogey turbo gases. There's a lot of variety for certain things. The challenging bits for these cars, and any vintage car really, becomes all the trim and all the interior bits. Since Audi tradition decides, and this is frankly why these cars are, I think, not valued as highly here, is because you can't buy things from Audi for them anymore. Audi, everything is no longer available. And so you need a connection that can order from Audi tradition and send you things, whatever's still available. But mid and lower door trims for these, they are, I actually just recently did a piece about this on YouTube. You can find that video. But finding the authentic trim piece, I wasn't able to put together a complete set anymore, but I was already over 650 euros in terms of the cost. And so this car is actually running an aftermarket kit that was on eBay, and it comes from like Latvia or something. For a daily driver, I highly suggest, especially if your original ones are in good shape, take them off and preserve them somewhere, clean them up really good, give them some Vinyl X, and then run these, what I'd call disposable set, for your daily. Because while they don't look perfect, and you can see there's a pretty good gap on that front fender, that's a telltale sign of the aftermarket trim. They're just not quite long enough. But it absolutely will save your butt in terms of ruining your nice original pieces. So I think the whole set is like $100 or something, right around that, chipped, which is a definite must-have for a daily driver. Even if your car is just old and they're just shot, if you've got no other option, they're certainly workable. And I've actually thought, like, I could put a little black vinyl on that little spot here where it's missing, and you could at least fool the eye at that point. But, you know, come on, why couldn't we have made that just a little longer? Anyhow, body-wise, you know, these cars tend to rust right here because leaves and things get up here and fall down and get stuck in here. So do yourself a favor, once a year at least, pull off this fender liner and clean that out really good, and then use something like fluid film in here and just coat the daylights out of it. So if you do that, and then if you do have any rust, like this one had a little bit of rust down here, and I did in another video when I was replacing this trim, I cleaned it up, and then I used this Pour 15 rust stop on that, and then I've actually done a little fluid film in there since. But that's a spot where they rust. And underneath the rear rails on these, like, so if you stick your head up underneath the rear bumper and look up at the frame rails, that's another spot. Coat them with fluid film really good. And just the general body seams, you know, inside the doors, you know, keep an eye on this area down here. These are obviously in good shape. B-pillar lowers, you know, make sure there's no rust down in there. Again, I use a little bit of fluid film strategically placed around those seams in the winter months. And obviously the other thing to talk about body-wise would be the bumper. Welcome to unicorn meat. So these do not exist, especially the US spec bumpers are no longer available and have been no longer available for quite some time. So if you have a cracked one, or if you shatter yours, someone backs into a parking lot, you're in trouble. They turn up used once in a while, but expect to pay $600 for a used one, and it's probably not going to be perfect. yeah, with that said, the early car windshield glass in the US, I've been actually trying to find glass for this. You have Fuyao, China, which is a no thank you. Or you have PGW, which is Pittsburgh. And I think it's also Chinese, but that's probably the better of the two options. And the trick here is, you used to be able to get Pilkington, but and I think you still can for the 95 or the later cars that don't have the antenna in the windshield, or like a 94 where you don't need the antenna in the windshield. But the ones that have it in the center of the glass, you have very limited options in terms of maintaining your stock dual antenna setup. So this one is going to hopefully be getting a Pittsburgh windshield here soon, and I will post an update about that when it happens. But getting glass is also becoming quite a challenge. Don't even talk about the rear windows. So yeah, there's some definite gambles that you take in driving this. If somebody hits it, it's done. Highly suggest getting Grundy collector car insurance. And yes, specifically Grundy versus Hagerty here in the States. I found the Hagerty to be twice as expensive and more restrictions on usage, etc. So I have Grundy on this car, and I will be putting Grundy on this car as well. And I want to say this one is, I can't even remember what I have it insured for at the moment, maybe 15, something like that. But it's like $240 a year. And granted, doesn't get driven that much. This one actually, once it goes on Grundy, will no longer be a daily driver. I'm going to start driving the S8. This will get collector plates and, basically get driven on nice days like today. So anyhow, aside from that, oil changes are super cheap and easy. I don't use anything really fancy. I've used Mobil 1 1030 on this, maybe 530 in the winter. So an oil change, like a filter, is $8, $9, and then $25 worth of oil. Really cheap. Fuel economy on the highway, about 24. Around town, depends on how aggressive you drive. You could probably get anywhere from 9 to maybe 13-ish, somewhere in there. I actually don't really pay attention to it, to be honest, but on a full tank of fuel, if I'm, say, driving this out just interstate, you get about 400 miles on a tank from my recollection. It's been a while since I've really had to do a long drive in one, but they're not terrible, considering what they are and the potential. Even this RS2 car, I actually get better mileage with this than I do with the Pearl car. I've gotten 25 on this coming back from Colorado, or just actually when I was on the flatlands in Nebraska and whatnot. But it's also got a Strumung exhaust, which, whether or not it's tune or weight related, because I save a fair amount of weight just switching the stock exhaust off of that. But yeah, aside from that, if you can find a really nice, well-maintained one, and you can keep up with the maintenance, really good cars. That's why I still drive it. It costs me less. My wife has a C7 A6, and that car has had more issues and more expense in terms of just routine maintenance and things. It's a lot more needy than these old cars, believe it or not, at least in my finding. I was talking to a neighbor the other day, and he was telling me about his I think it was Ford Edge or something, and how he'd put $10,000 in maintenance into this car in the prior 3.5 years or something. And I haven't put 10 grand into all of my Audis in 5 years. Or longer, actually. It's pretty amazing. These are, like I said, you'll do periodic rebuilds of suspension due to age, etc., but really solid car if you get a good one. So sorry, this is kind of long-winded, but I'd be happy to answer any other questions you might have in the comments area. So if you have further questions about where to find things, reliability of certain things, etc., by all means, ask questions, and I'll be happy to talk to you in there. But thank you for watching. More coming soon.